Hey everybody and welcome back. In this video we're going to do a quick talk about game types and how you should choose one when you're planning your game. The idea of this is that when we're moving into our Let's Build series, you'll have some idea of what kind of game you want to create and the pros and cons of each type. Before I get started, a huge thank you to everyone who subscribed. The channel's growing really quickly now, it's absolutely insane. My mind is officially blown. If you haven't yet subscribed, feel free to do that. Hit that notification icon as well. And let me know what you think in the comments below. Obviously, an even bigger thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon. Your names will be scrolling across the bottom of the screen as we speak. So let's jump right into this then. So when we plan our game, it's very important that we have some idea of what kind of game we want to create. Before we even get into the planning stages, it's good to have some kind of premise, some ideas of how a storyline would go in a game that you're developing, so that you know roughly what kind of content the game needs to have. Ideally though, you'd have an understanding of the different types of game, and ultimately they boil down to two types. You have linear and you have non-linear. There are different types of linear gameplay, but non-linear is essentially where each choice you make, or a number of choices you make, result in a different chain of events, which would ultimately lead to different endings. The first of our examples here on the left hand side is a simple linear, which is commonly used for things like visual novels, where you simply have a story flowing through as you've written it. There are no multiple choices, there are no various endings. It's simple start, event, number of events, and then it comes to the end. So the player is simply effectively playing through a linear series of events. Now the pros to this are they're very easy to write, very easy to code, and the number of renders is kept to a minimum because you're not having to render multiple different renders for each event. The cons of this, of course, is that it can be less interesting if your story is not very engaging. Your players may feel less inclined to play the game because they feel like they have less of an impact on the events, so they may not take it seriously. There's no real replay value once you've played through a linear VN. There's no different outcomes to try and achieve, so there's no real reason to replay it, which means that you're going to have a much smaller audience. The next kind of example is the same as linear in that there is one start and one end, but perhaps a decision that you make at the start of an event will affect how the actual event goes. It achieves the same ending, but the images and the text that you see throughout that particular event, or maybe a series of events afterwards, are different, but ultimately you still end up at the same place. This is more common certainly amongst dating sims and VNs, because it gives the illusion of there being multiple paths when in fact there aren't. It's just there's two versions of each event, and you could have either depending on a decision that you've made earlier in the game. The pros to this is that it's still quite simple to write. There is a little bit more code required, but not too much. There's still not too many renders, and it gives the illusion of the game being non-linear. The cons, of course, are that it's going to take you longer to develop that sort of game. It's going to increase the player's expectations because they have the illusion of the game being non-linear. It means that they're going to have higher expectations of the outcomes, and it's much harder to balance. By that I mean the difficulty. For example, if a player wants to get a certain a version of an event, it's difficult to make each kind of outcome equally rewarding, and a lot of games fall down in that because ultimately they have one correct choice and one incorrect choice, which is down to the dev whether they want the game to play that way or not. But in an ideal world, you'd have both events being equally rewarding so that the player doesn't feel like they're missing out on something. The final one is the non-linear, and this is a very basic kind of Christmas tree formation, but this isn't the only way that these games can be designed. But ultimately the game is littered with choices that you make which will affect the outcome. There's multiple different endings, there's multiple different paths that you can take, and there's no illusion about it. You will be on a different path every time you make a decision that affects the route of the gameplay. The pros of this are that you get many more story options. You can have each branch taking you down a massively different story arc, which gives you huge replay value because people are going to want to experience every single different outcome, which gives you better audience engagement because they're going to spend a lot more time reading the text because the decisions are more important, and you're also going to get a lot more time with the characters, so people feel more invested in them, especially if the decisions have some kind of consequences, which means that the games are more likely to be remembered. Now, the cons of this obviously is that the development time is considerably longer. We could be talking about having to render sort of 5 or 6 different versions of a single event if that's the way you want to develop the game, which of course means that you need to spend a lot more time doing it. The majority of your players are going to get lost trying to play the best outcome and complain about there not being a walkthrough or wanting a walkthrough because they don't understand that there is no best series of events, and a walkthrough is only going to take them down one path, which may not necessarily be the best path for them. This is particularly common in adult VNs because people want the best scenes and they don't understand that every scene isn't necessarily a good or bad outcome, which means that you're going to have to be fencing that question pretty much all the time. It's also very difficult to balance the difficulty with the outcomes because you want every outcome to be equally rewarding. So you want the decisions that are made to be not difficult in either way. It has to be a kind of a moral or a personal preference kind of decision, not a one of them seems really easy and one of them just seems really hard. And it's quite hard to keep track of game logic and interconnections. Let's say, for example, you have multiple different events that the player can take part in, and you have a reference to one event from another. Very quickly the game gets messy in that regard because you're throwing random variables in to say, oh, if he made this decision earlier, then you need to say this. If the character made a decision in a different story arc, they need to be saying this, and very quickly that can get very convoluted and very messy. So you need to be very good at keeping track of all of your outcomes and know the best way to keep them kind of logged so that you don't make mistakes, because there's nothing more immersion breaking than having a player buy a red car and then a character 10 minutes later saying, oh, I love your blue car or something like that, because you're thinking, well, hang on, no, that's not what I've got. So it's very important to make sure that you keep track of these things. So it can be quite difficult. It's also important to understand what your limitations are when you're developing a game. If you're still quite new to Ren'Py or any programming language, yes, you can try and learn as you go along, but you need to be starting and designing a game at the level that you're currently at. There's no point starting a game that's very complicated if you're a very beginner with the intention of learning more as you go along, because your first few updates are going to be just bug-ridden and it's going to be a mess and people are just going to rip you apart for it. So start the game with the intention of being able to finish it quickly and understanding how the game's going to work. Also, it's very important to understand the limitations of your equipment. If you've got a very basic machine that can't render very quickly, there's no point promising that you're going to be updating every month if you haven't even managed to be able to provide enough renders for a single scene within that month. So again, be realistic about what your options are and what your limitations are. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you found it informative or useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks very much. Bye bye.